All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about explicit and implicit subject forms. And that's basically going to help us kind of set things up to talk about the new formalism I was talking about before. So as we said, we've been talking about subjects the whole book, right? So subject is just a point of focus you draw your attention to. It's embedded in every intention you produce. But what we didn't really talk about was the fact that subjects actually come in two kinds of forms, right? So to go over this first point, subjects have two forms in terms of how they appear to the conscious mind, right? So, and I word it that way basically to say, and if you remember what I said that things can appear differently from the perspective of the conscious mind compared to the perspective of the subconscious, right? So to the subconscious, this isn't the case. So subjects look exactly the same. There's not two forms to the subconscious. They all look the same. Nothing differently ever occurs with them. But to the conscious mind, they look different, right? So there can be just two different forms from conscious-minded perspective. So one of those forms, and this is actually the one we've been working with the whole book, is what are called explicit subject forms. So explicit subject forms are distinct, obvious, and easy to define, right? So just, in other words, to the conscious mind, they're very easy to sort of recognize. And so, as an example, let's say I want to charge the love emotion while focused on my girlfriend, right? So I would focus on her, tell some story that revolves around her, and then she would carry the charge of that particular frequency. When I focus on her, the subconscious memory switches to an active state, and I feel all of that emotion that I charged up more actively. And then if I'm not thinking about her, I'll still feel it in my mood, depending on how charged it is. Now, so she would be an explicit subject form. So she's a very distinct and easy to define subject, and she carries the charge, right? Now, if I want to charge the inner peace emotion, then I might focus on some serene environment in nature or something. And then that environment becomes the subject, right? So if I change little tiny things in the environment, then it might become a little less obvious or a little less distinct. But for the most part, the environment itself is an explicit subject form, right? And the environment will generally carry the charge. So, like I said, these subject forms we've been working with through the whole book, right? So the new one that we haven't really talked much about are what I call implicit subject forms. So to go over this point, implicit subject forms are more intangible, right? So they're more intangible and are harder to clearly define. So what is an example of an implicit subject form? Well, the example I like to give in the book is basically I want to talk about, set up an example with working in the office. So let's just say you're in the office, right, and you receive an email that's telling you to download some document or open some document and then print it, right? So very simple, standard stuff for an office environment, right? So let's say you download the document, like you walk through the office and you go to the printer and you pick up the document. Let's say that someone asked you to define or name each subject that you focused on during that activity, right? So, which is fairly simple. You might say, well, one subject was the email itself, maybe the heading or the subject. You clicked on it, and then you saw a command to open this document. You focused on this document, and you downloaded it, and then you went to the printer and picked it up, right? So the printer is a subject, and the document you picked up is also a subject. But here's the thing, right? So that's not an exhaustive list. So that's not all the subjects you focused on, right? You could still come up with more, right? You could say at some point you focused on different tabs on the computer. The computer itself was a subject. Maybe the keyboard, right? The lights in the room. When you walked across the office, you saw people at some point. They were subjects they were a point of focus for your attention at some point. You could even think about things you thought about, right? Because your attention can be split between many different things in different amounts, right? Things you thought about during that time might be a subject, right? And so on and so forth. So I could keep playing this game forever, right? The floor at some point might have been a subject. So in other words, it would be very difficult to name all of the subjects that you focused on during that simple activity. You can focus on some of them, right? So some of them might come in a more explicit form, but it would be very difficult to name all of them. In other words, what's happening is that some of these subjects are becoming more intangible and are harder to clearly define, right? And it's very similar to exactly what happens when, let's say you're on a number line, right? And you're moving from, let's say, 4 to 5, right? So something very simple. It would be like saying, name all the numbers between 4 and 5. Obviously, you couldn't do that, right? Because there's an infinite amount of numbers. In math, that's called uncountable infinity. Countable infinity would be like all the integers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And you can do that for infinity, right? Uncountable infinity would be 1.01, 1.001, 1.002. So you can't really count it in an easy or clear way, right? So that you kind of see that same thing. So it's kind of a it's kind of approaching the behavior of continuity, right? Which is a geometric principle, but that's not really important now. So as you engage in that activity, there are going to be some forms that you focus on that are more implicit, right? And those are exactly what I say here, implicit subject forms. So with implicit subject forms, there's actually a new phenomenon that kind of happens related to subject closeness, right? So to go to this point, implicit subject forms can demonstrate a new kind of subject closeness where they are smushed together. Now in chapter 10, we talked about subject closeness in terms of how similar subjects appear from subconscious perspective. So to the subconscious mind, if subject B looks very similar to subject A, you could access the subconscious memory associated with A while focusing on subject B. So that was what we meant by subject closeness before. But this case, there's kind of a new kind of subject closeness, which really has to do with how quickly your attention went from one subject to the next. Because presumably, if this theory is correct, the theory that we've been working on is that every experience you have is stored to subconscious memory, and your subconscious organizes those memories on the basis of subjects, the subjects you focused on, right? So if you have implicit subject forms, which are harder to define subjects, but let's say that they occur in a more continuous way. So my attention went across different subjects very, very, very quickly. So exactly like you can imagine happened during that activity. So when I focused on the computer and then the email and then the download button or whatever, my attention kind of went between all those things relatively quickly, right? Not every single subject in the activity, but for any subject that I focused on during the activity, there was some subject that I also focused on very quickly in a sense that was next to it, right? So let's say I focus on one of those subjects, even if it's in its explicit form in this case. Let's say I focus on the subject of the printer, right? I access the subconscious memory associated with the printer. I feel the same thoughts and feelings I had when I was focused on the printer. Now, those same thoughts and feelings are going to, in a sense, be connected to the next subject I focused on, right? Or the implicit subject, because I changed my attention to that next subject so fast, right? That essentially the association or the compulsion stored in the subconscious memory will cause me to focus on that next subject, right? And when I focus on that next subject, that'll cause me to focus on the next subject after that because they're so smushed together. They're very difficult to separate in terms of associations, right? That's much easier to do with explicit subject forms, but it's harder to do with implicit subject forms. The specific reason they're implicit is because I change my attention from one subject to the next so quickly that it's harder to properly analyze all the subjects. At some point, they reach an implicit form. Now, that principle of closeness or smushed togetherness is going to be actually very important in the next video because we're going to talk about the consequence of that more directly. But you can kind of even get a sense of this idea if you just think about something you did, right? Some activity you performed, and if you focus on one aspect of the activity, you might just also be reminded of other thoughts and feelings you had immediately preceding or after that activity, right? After that particular moment in the whole activity, I should say, right? And that's because of this smushed togetherness. Now, to go over this point, you can see if you're dealing with subconscious memories, right, associated with the whole activity, if you just wanted to, for whatever reason, focus on all these subconscious memories for some activity, you're eventually going to start dealing with implicit subject forms. You can no longer stick with explicit subject forms. And to just go over this point, is implicit subject forms are generally the form subjects will take on when performing an activity, right? More specifically, what I meant is that you're going to start dealing with them to fully describe an activity. And if you really think about it, this is probably unnecessary. But this is just something this kind of reminds me of. If you really think about it, because we're getting into principles of continuity, right, and we're trying to exhaustively or maximize the way we think about or really count all of the subjects involved in some activity, and we're dealing with something that almost appears continuous, you can almost kind of see something similar to an integral forming or integration, right? If you really want to stretch it, right, you can almost say when we're charging emotion, right, because we're focusing on explicit subject, like in a single place, we didn't really have to focus on other subjects like that. This is almost like differentiation, right? In this one, we want to focus on the subject in a continuous way, in a way that almost develops a path, right? And that's where path formalism comes in, which we're going to talk about in the next video. In the process of mapping all the subjects in an activity, and because each of those subjects is so close together or smushed together, the association stored in them sort of makes me also think about the next implicit subject in that path. You can kind of see something similar to integration developing, right? Which is something that happens in mathematics when you're also trying to look at a path, right? But that's not, that's just a kind of weird way of looking at it that this kind of reminds me of, right? And it has the same sort of relationship between differentiation and integration, right? So the inverses of each other. We're going to talk a little bit about almost a kind of inverse nature between transcendental performance and emotion later. But like I said, that's not really important. That's just some kooky way of that I started looking at it that this reminds me of. But to go over this last point, let me just read it off. To charge for transcendental performance, we're going to need to charge implicit subject forms, right? So in other words, remember what we said, right? For the drop-off problem, what we're going to have to learn how to do, or the problem we're going to have to learn how to solve, is how to maintain some emotional intensity while focused on different subjects. So from here we can see that while performing some activity, right, all these subconscious memories involved are eventually, if we focus on all the ones involved, eventually we're going to have to start dealing with implicit subject forms. So this kind of tells us that the solution probably is going to involve learning how to charge implicit subject forms, right? So how do we charge an implicit form when it's very difficult to focus on it in the first place? How would we get it to enter an active state, which is also the requirement that we mentioned to solve the drop-off problem? Well, that's actually a question we're going to answer. Yeah, I think we're going to answer in the next video. I don't talk about necessarily how to charge it yet in the next video, but I'm going to set up the basic answer, which is going to be path formalism. So we're going to set it up in the next video. And that's basically going to be a new type of construct in subconscious memory, right? But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's explicit and implicit subject forms. I know, like I said, it's very abstract, right? But that's just how this is kind of how I've come to think of it when it comes to charging for the purpose of transcendental performance. I don't really know how else to kind of analyze it to make it, make it less abstract and more concrete. But this is basically the ideas I came to, and they help me to feel like I really understand what's going on. But like I said, if it's a little abstract, if it's difficult, then I recommend to read the book. I pretty much say the same thing, and or the information on the website, or just rewatch the video. But it should also make more sense when we talk about subconscious paths in the next video. So I would probably read it like one more time, or watch the video once more, and then move on to the next video, and then try to put the two together, because I think it'll make more sense then. All right, so yeah, that's it for now. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.